Are you hoping by him leaving there is some de-escalation?
I hope that's what this means. Yeah, absolutely. Uh, you know, nobody in law enforcement is saying federal law enforcement should not be enforcing federal law. That's ridiculous, right? But I don't think it's unreasonable to think that federal law enforcement should operate the same standards and professionalism that the rest of law enforcement in the state does. And really, the way that we've all been working together this whole time before all of this started. We have relationships with all these different federal agencies, with the U.S. Attorney's Office. We work together literally every single day to go after the actual worst of the worst, people doing murders and carjackers, gang members, all those types of things. And so it's just kind of disrupted what has been really, really positive, collaborative law enforcement between everyone here in the state, local, and federal. I think outsiders have this bubble, just like, the outsiders have this world they're living in. I mean, we're talking about people that have lived here for decades, literally decades. Someone that was just picked up, I'm told, as a city employee for like 20-something years, legally working in the country. People that are American citizens, like repeatedly. It's not right. Like, I don't know what to say. It's just some of the things that are happening are not right. And then you see these videos over and over again. It's certainly not the way we train police. And I don't think it's too much to ask the federal government to conduct law enforcement in a way that respects the Constitution, in a way that, lives up to the standards that people expect law enforcement in this country to have today, to be professional, to use tactically sound methods. I think a lot of the videos you see, it looks like policing from 30 years ago at best.
Really, very cynically, that the goal here is really just to show force. It is to create intimidation. It is to stoke fear. It is political theater. If you were engaging in genuine law enforcement to protect public safety, the approach to this entire operation would be completely different. What we're seeing is just 3,000 agents on the streets of Minneapolis, a blue state with a very small percentage of immigrants in their community. What you'd see instead is targeted enforcement in states like Texas or Florida, where we have more significant numbers of immigrants. And what I mean by targeted enforcement is what ICE has done throughout its history before today. That is, they use intelligence, they use records, they use data to identify people who do have serious criminal records. When I was serving as U.S. Attorney, what they would do is compile lists of people with a prior criminal record of aggravated, serious, violent felonies. And then they would spend resources to go find those people and deport them. What we're seeing instead on the streets of Minneapolis is, let's just go around to places where we might find them. Of course, these Kavanaugh stops, with the Supreme Court has now approved, at least temporarily, is we can base our reasonable suspicion on language or appearance or location or somebody's job, and just question people in a dragnet situation. That may yield large numbers, but it isn't going to yield the kinds of people who actually pose a threat to public safety. And so I think we need some sizable changes on the ground in Minneapolis, and frankly, at the leadership levels all the way up the chain. I am concerned. I worked with ICE as a U.S. attorney with its various components, and I worry that what they are doing with ICE in Minneapolis is such an abuse of law enforcement protocols that it's just going to have to be either renamed or dismantled. They are doing decades of damage, and not only to ICE, but to every other law enforcement agency, because public trust is so critically important to its ability to work with law enforcement. But the idea that there's going to be no criminal investigation by the Department of Justice here is absolutely absurd. We have so many unanswered questions about what happened here, and the likelihood of some criminal liability certainly exists in light of what was happening with these agents on the ground. There's a very high bar for holding law enforcement officers criminally accountable for mistakes, poor judgment, panicking, those kinds of things. It has to be an intentional deprivation of civil rights. But at this point, we don't know. What were the conversations? What is the evidence? There hasn't been access. And in light of what we're seeing in the federal response, I think it behooves the state to conduct a full investigation. But as you say, although we have a court order now requiring federal law enforcement to preserve the evidence, there has been no indication that state actors are going to have access to it. And getting that access immediately is critically important. Months or years later isn't going to do them much good.
I'm Mark Ruley, Police Chief of the City of Brooklyn Park. Behind me is a bunch of amazing police chiefs that are here in support of a very short but very important message that we want to share with you. What you won't hear from any of us today is rhetoric of abolish ICE or that there shouldn't be immigration enforcement. The truth is, immigration enforcement is necessary for our national security and for local security. But how it's done is extremely important. In fact, we have a long history of working exceptionally well with our federal partners, including ICE agents, and we have seen the best of them perform their job extremely well in the past. With that said, recently, as the last 2 weeks, we, as law enforcement community, have been receiving endless complaints about civil rights violations in our streets from U.S. citizens. What we're hearing is they're being stopped in traffic stops or on the street with no cause and being forced to demand paperwork to determine if they are here legally. As this went on over the past 2 weeks, we started hearing from our police officers the same complaints as they fell victim to this while off duty. Every one of these individuals is a person of color who has had this happen to them. In Brooklyn Park, one particular officer that shared her story with me was stopped as she passed ICE going down the roadway. When they boxed her in, they demanded her paperwork, of which she's a U.S. citizen and clearly would not have any paperwork. When she became concerned about the rhetoric and the way she was being treated, she pulled out her phone. In an attempt to record the incident, the phone was knocked out of her hands, preventing her from recording it. The officer had their guns drawn during this interaction. And after the officer became so concerned, they were forced to identify themselves as a Brooklyn Park police officer in hopes of slowing the incident and de-escalating the incident down. The agents then immediately left after hearing this, making no other comments, no other apologies, just got in their vehicles and left. I wish I could tell you that this was an isolated incident. In fact, many of the chiefs standing behind me have similar incidents with their off-duty officers. This isn't just important because it happened to off-duty police officers, but what it did do is we know that our officers know what the Constitution is, they know what right and wrong is, and they know when people are being targeted, and that's what they were. If it is happening to our officers, it pains me to think of how many of our community members are falling victim to this every day. It has to stop. This behavior erodes the trust that these police chiefs have worked tirelessly for the last 5 years and theoretically the last 60 years to stop this exact behavior from happening.
Because you were just in Minnesota. There are Americans who want more immigration enforcement, who don't necessarily want ICE to be abolished, who are worried about immigration and border security and are worried about violent criminals. Those people are out there. Some of those people are the ones protesting in Minnesota because what they're seeing immigration enforcement do in the interior is not what they voted for. Explain what you saw, who you met.
Well, what I saw in Minnesota was a state full of people that was really devoted to protecting their neighbors. And these are people who are, of many different, they're people who probably have many different, views on immigration, but they don't want their neighbors kidnapped. They don't want their kids go to school with kidnapped. They're doing things like, following ICE around and recording them when they have encounters. They're making sure people are fed. They're making sure people can pay their rent. And they're doing this because Donald Trump has decided to use, federal agents as a partisan militia to inflict pain and suffering on the parts of the country that did not support him as much as he believed they should. This is not really about immigration enforcement. It's about intimidating people for having the wrong political views by sending masked armed federal agents into their cities to make their lives miserable. A lot of conservatives seem shocked that this is the reaction, but this is precisely what happens when you do that. This is precisely what happens when you send people into a city to intimidate those people and make them feel as though you can do anything to them without consequences. These men are wearing masks, and the government, as you just described, is completely willing to allow them to shoot people in the street, in the back, in the face, and then just completely decline to investigate or hold anybody accountable or even name the people involved. And I think, a lot of regular Trump voters who have conservative views on immigration do not want to see masked federal agents shooting Americans in the street because, they did something that those federal agents did not like.
Was there an assumption, Adam, that the people that were going to go out in Minnesota to protest ICE, that these were all, seasoned operatives, that they were all agitators, they were part of organized groups who were never going to support the administration no matter what, and that the American public would see that and they would side with immigration enforcement?
I think there was an expectation that that there would be a bunch of rabble rousers who might respond with violence, and the administration would therefore have a popular mandate to crack down even further. Instead, what these people did was engage in a strategy of observation, avoidance of direct physical confrontation with federal agents. All these confrontations that we've seen have been initiated by them in terms of being physically confronted. The people who they confronted were filming them or were in the area. But they have focused on protection and observation rather than, engaging in any sort of act of violence. This is a nonviolent civic resistance. And I think that has been very frustrating for the Trump administration, which wanted sort of the spectacle of riots that they could use to crack down even further. And the way that that that's the case is that they keep insisting that there are violent riots everywhere, even though that's not what's happening. And there's there's literally no footage attesting to that allegation.
Yeah, I just think there's an interesting wrinkle here, and it was on display at the top of the show, David, and that was the last woman who said she doesn't really agree with the protests, but she's sick to her stomach over what she's seen ICE do. And that is interesting. It's interesting to have somebody, and I'm not sure if the Trump administration expected this, to have somebody who wants the immigration enforcement done, who doesn't believe in the protesters, doesn't believe they should be interfering or stopping, but also was able to look at the images that she's seeing and come to the conclusion herself that what immigration officers are doing is wrong, that it's worse than the protesters, that they are the ones that are crossing a line.
So here's what I don't think Trump has gotten as a result of his election. There are a lot of people on the Trump base and the MAGA base who are genuinely anti-immigrant. They really, really want fewer immigrants. But there's a lot more people who voted for Trump because they were anti-chaos. In other words, they saw the flood of people across the border, the flood of migrants into city streets, and they saw it as chaotic. They saw it as disordered, and they wanted order. And there's a version of Trump where he comes in and he gets the border under control and then does normal, humane deportation, immigration enforcement, the way previous presidents have, from Obama to Biden to Bush, and just follow the normal process. He would have the wind at his back right now. But instead, he substituted one form of chaos for another form of chaos, one that is increasingly deadly. And now that you're seeing unarmed people shot dead in the streets, and you're seeing the administration's stories about so many of these alleged attacks on Border Patrol or ICE blowing up in court, they're being exposed again and again as lying. The chaos calculation is shifting against him. So now the people who don't want chaos are looking at Trump and saying, you're the cause, you're the reason. Can't we just have sensible policies and normal order?
Yeah, and you had that one gentleman say, rightly, that President Obama deported a lot of folks, 3.1 million immigrants, migrants, and they'll say that the numbers they had in terms of violent criminals were, up around 90%. They did it, not popular when he was doing it, but Americans weren't getting shot and killed in the street. And that is another part of this, and I think you rightly point this out. There are Americans who believe they are there just protesting, who do not understand or maybe hadn't fully anticipated, in the case of Renee Good or Alex Preddy, that the rules of engagement had changed. The ground rules had changed.
Totally. So they think they're operating in the normal world where, as we've seen, police aren't always restrained. We have had bad police incidents, many bad police incidents, but as a general matter, police respond to the public with restraint and professionalism and discipline. If you're out there in the public, that's the norm for police. And so if you're protesting now, you think you're living in that norm, you're not anymore. You're living in a world where these individuals, many of them are terribly trained. Many of them believe they're on some sort of ideological crusade, and they're not being held accountable in the slightest. They're being granted an enormous amount of discretion, an enormous amount of immunity. And all that is adding up to is authoritarian violence, which is chaotic.
John and Peter, I want to get you on this because you're at the White House, you cover the White House, you speak to sources there. I wonder what really is behind the president's changing tune on this, why he called Governor Walz, why he called Mayor Frey, why he switched out Bovino for Tom Homan. Is it that Republicans were getting uncomfortable? Was it calls from Republican senators? Is it Greg Abbott saying they need to recalibrate? Is it that he doesn't want to see Americans killed? Or is it, as the Wall Street Journal reports, that Donald Trump thought the Minnesota operation looked chaotic and not strong, according to, they say, people familiar with the matter? Is there any one reason, overarching reason, John?
I think it's a combination of things, Katie. I mean, what President Trump did this past weekend, and it was a rare weekend for him in Washington. He wasn't in Palm Beach. He wasn't out golfing. What was he doing? He was inside. He was watching television, and he was seeing the nonstop footage of what happened in Minneapolis. He was getting updates on his phone as well, and worried calls from Republicans. And he, as we've reported, grew increasingly unhappy with how people for his administration were talking about this on television, that what they were saying, and that's Secretary Noem, certainly Bovino, what they're saying simply wasn't supported by the facts, wasn't supported by the videos that he and the rest of the nation were seeing. So I do think the chaos was part of this. I think that he recognized that the politics of this was getting away from him. So no, we should not overstate that this is suddenly an about face on deportations, that suddenly these ICE operations and Border Patrol operations will cease. What I think is clear is that there's going to be a bit of a de-escalation in Minneapolis, at least for the time being. Bovino is out, Homan in. I think the president is tired of what he sees as the problem there in that particular city, hence the calls with Walz and the mayor of Minneapolis, who we should note, by the way, still remain under Department of Justice investigation. So it's not like everyone is all kumbaya here. This is still very much a political operation. The president's still looking at fraud in the Somali community, et cetera, alleged fraud, I should say. And there certainly could be, this operation could move to another city down the road. But I think there's an acknowledgement that, and Republicans unhappy about it, that they needed to take their foot off the gas at least a little bit when it comes to the Twin Cities.
Yeah, Peter, same question to you.
Yeah, I agree with all. Of course, I think he's watching not just maybe this network and maybe not one of the other networks that was showing some of these pictures, but even on the network he prefers, there were skeptical questions, skeptical anchors who were saying, wait a second, this guy didn't seem to be a threat. The video didn't seem to suggest that he was an assassin, didn't seem to suggest he was a domestic terrorist. And so even on the right, he was hearing voices saying, hold on a second, this isn't matching what we're seeing. You see a lot of, Republicans starting to voice their concerns publicly, and some, I think, privately. Kevin Stitt, the governor of Oklahoma, Governor Welch of Vermont. Marjorie Taylor Greene was on the outs with the White House, but put it I think, in a way that a lot of people on the MAGA side could understand. She said, what if this were reversed? What if this were the Biden government, the federal government, coming after J6ers who didn't, pose a threat? What would we be saying about that if that happened? And I think also the Second Amendment part of it was a factor on the right as well, because basically there are a couple of lines out of the federal government saying, hey, if you come to a protest with a gun, you are by definition suspect, and we assume potentially a criminal. That rankled people who spent their lives fighting for gun rights, for the notion that you can legally carry a gun in a public place, and that doesn't make you a criminal. So all of these things, I think, came together to make him think twice about how he wanted to keep going. And he has been sort of upset, as people have said, with Secretary Noem, and she's been the public face of this, and it didn't help her with with her president.